Inside the historic wood-paneled congressional room, the heavy, stifling atmosphere felt devoid of oxygen, substituted instead by a tense, electrifying pressure. Representative Ilhan Omar clutched two seemingly plain but immensely significant pieces of paper. She held one page in each of her carefully manicured hands, her knuckles turning pale beneath the harsh, unforgiving glow of the ceiling lights. In that exact, excruciating millisecond, precisely 47 high-definition television cameras positioned in an imposing arc at the rear of the room simultaneously recorded the subtle, violent micro-expressions flickering across her customarily impassive features. Her left hand, visibly trembling with an uncharacteristic, suppressed anxiety, grasped a standard, legally required Federal Election Commission expenditure report. To a casual observer, it appeared to be just a tedious, bureaucratic file, a dull spreadsheet, crammed with infinite names and dates of transactions. However, in this particular space and on this specific afternoon, the document had been transformed into a deadly political weapon. On this wrinkled sheet of paper, a specific, irrefutable, and disastrous seven-figure monetary amount was glaringly illuminated with a vibrant, neon yellow highlighter. This colossal figure sat awkwardly and damningly near the bottom of the extensive financial record, positioned right next to the title of a particular political consulting firm and the identity of the man who managed it. In her right hand, Omar elevated an entirely different sort of document. It was a newly printed, high-contrast image capturing her own digital declaration, her own passionate statement, extracted directly from her social media account and enlarged in a colossal, heavy, distinct typeface. It was deliberately formatted to be easily readable from the most distant, darkest corners of the public gallery. We must get dark money out of politics. Transparency is everything. She swallowed forcefully, her throat inexplicably parched, as she looked frantically between the harsh, unemotional, numerical truth on the left and the grand, progressive ideology beaming from the right. As she shifted her gaze, her countenance revealed an abrupt, involuntary, and utterly catastrophic response. It constituted the sort of raw, unscripted human reaction that political strategists dedicate their entire lives to avoiding. It was a look destined to be instantly preserved, infinitely clipped, harshly altered, and circulated more than 11 million times across all dominant social networks before the sun could even begin to set over the Washington Monument. The response was a deep, ruinous recognition of total void. There was absolutely no story-driven contradiction between the two distinct pages for her to shrewdly manipulate, no verbal escape route to jump through, and no partisan protective maneuvering that could conceivably change the basic rules of mathematics. For a brief, excruciating fraction of a second, every carefully constructed political front, every defensive stance, and every verbal barrier she had spent years perfecting inside those harsh marble walls collapsed all at once under the overwhelming, irrefutable burden of pure, objective evidence. Meanwhile, positioned at the extreme opposite end of the massive, gleaming mahogany committee table, a bespectacled gentleman in a modest, flawlessly knotted navy blue suit remained completely, almost unsettlingly, motionless. House Speaker Mike Johnson kept his hands cleanly and peacefully interlaced on the desk. He bided his time with the tranquil, unbreakable, maddening endurance of a veteran attorney who had just delivered a beautifully direct, snare-filled question and was now completely prepared to recline and let the subsequent deafening, agonizing quiet handle the difficult work. Almost 30 minutes before this volatile, career-shifting instance, she had strode into the massive hearing chamber, radiating a sense of total, undeniable, and complete dominance. She had observed the historic environment as though she were an affluent property developer considering extensive, contemporary updates to a dilapidated building. The room was notably, almost perilously, more packed than the formal daily congressional agenda implied it should ever be. News had swiftly spread through the complex, gossip-heavy corridors of the Capitol that the Speaker of the House had abruptly and very uncharacteristically inserted his own name onto the witness and interrogation list for what was supposed to be a completely standard, easily dismissible administrative oversight session. No one among the skeptical, experienced press pool or the deeply rooted political class could remember the last instance a contemporary Speaker of the House had bothered to exit his luxurious suites to attend a minor, lower-level subcommittee meeting that he did not personally lead or explicitly direct. This abrupt deviation from normal procedures acted as a loud warning signal. Journalists, armed with the natural predatory intuition to detect vulnerability in the political arena, were crammed densely, 3 rows thick, against the decorative wood-lined rear wall, their massive telephoto lenses aimed, dialed in, and prepared. The spectator seating was utterly overflowing, reduced to a standing room only situation, with Capitol Hill aides wedged into the walkways. Hidden away in the 5th row, trying to stay unnoticed, was a completely unheralded, modest guest, a woman sporting a worn blue hijab who had navigated the roads through the night all the way from Minneapolis that morning, sharing her lengthy, desperate journey to the Capitol with absolutely no one. When Ilhan Omar eventually executed her eagerly awaited dramatic arrival, she did so, possessing her customary, undeniable, defiant panache. She engaged with the historic resident room as if it were a custom-built platform erected exclusively for her personal political display, subtly emanating the vibe that everyone else in attendance was simply a fortunate, ticketed spectator permitted to observe her craft. She slammed her bulky, leather-covered briefing portfolio onto the surface with a solid, intentional, echoing thud that reverberated sharply off the elevated plaster ceilings, immediately capturing the chamber's focus. She extended her hand and adjusted her flexible microphone exactly 1 calculated inch to the left. She decanted a glass of cold water from her reusable, logo-emblazoned bottle, observing the clear fluid fall flawlessly, and placed the cup with precise, uncompromising, obsessive purpose. Every single bodily motion, every tweak was performed with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of an individual who is urgently, obviously telegraphing to a highly observant, judgmental audience that they are not in the slightest bit nervous, daunted, or destabilized. Once the exhausted, silver-haired committee head formally gave her the floor for an introductory statement, she grabbed the chance with the fierce, kinetic power of someone aggressively, righteously taking back purloined goods. "I want to address exactly what is happening in this room today," she announced forcefully, her tone sounding crisp and distinct, declaring that the diligent American populace required total honesty and ethical clarity, even if the tainted, wealthy corridors of the Capitol failed to provide it. Her sharp, blaming stare moved slowly and intentionally down the extensive span of the curved panel table, ignoring her peers, until it fastened securely and fiercely upon Mike Johnson. She fiercely criticized the speaker, elevating her voice to charge him with historically and fundamentally categorizing her minority faith as intrinsically against the Constitution. She asserted, with escalating anger, that he had committed his whole professional legal trajectory and his political existence to mercilessly combating the civil rights and human liberties of individuals who appeared exactly like her, worshipped exactly like her, and originated from the exact same conflict-ridden backgrounds as she did. She deliberately pointed out his highly abnormal, procedurally strange, and questionable attendance at this specific minor hearing. Sporting a tense, mocking, incredibly thin smile that completely missed her icy eyes, She remarked, "I know a Sunday school classroom when I see one, Mr. Speaker, and I know precisely when the teacher thinks somebody needs to be sent down to the principal's office for a scolding. So let us skip the theatrical, moralizing pretense and get straight to the sermon you came here to deliver." A faint, frigid, unbelievably strained murmur spread quickly among the tightly packed, perspiring onlookers in the viewing area. The pure, undiluted animosity was startling even when measured against Washington's profoundly divided norms. If you have ever felt the profound, searing, instinctive exasperation of having a person intentionally use your deeply rooted convictions against you on national TV, or if you've been unjustly, maliciously told that your sheer existence somehow negates your basic right to speak before you even voice a single word, you comprehend the precise emotional resonance she was attempting to evoke. Her broadcasted, intentional, extremely premeditated, and intensely personal affront was executed with total, inflexible earnestness, explicitly intended to spread rapidly online and energize her liberal supporters. In the meantime, Mike Johnson had not even troubled himself to unseal his manila folder yet. He displayed absolutely zero external, physical, emotional, or physiological response to the harsh, intensely personal insult. He did not blush. He did not scowl. He simply kept his hands tranquilly, relaxedly intertwined, resting upon the gleaming timber. His spectacles sat marginally low on the arch of his nose. He flawlessly, intimidatingly personified the stoicism of an experienced, combat-tested lawyer who had devoted decades working in sweltering, antagonistic courtrooms in the South. He had discovered the difficult, ruthless reality that relentless stamina, emotional discipline, and extremely calculated, smothering quiet were the singular tools that consistently function perfectly every single time when facing an adversarial testifier. He elegantly, practically courteously, allowed her to finish her passionate, broad rant. He permitted the expected, victorious, affirming clapping from her devoted followers in the space to completely and absolutely fail to appear in the shocked, profoundly uneasy room. He allowed the subsequent, extremely clumsy silence to stretch on for a complete second and a half longer than necessary, pulling the agonizing stress until it was almost intolerable, causing the whole crowd and Omar herself to wonder if he had even processed a solitary word she had just yelled at him. Ultimately, acting with an excruciating, purposeful sluggishness that demanded total focus, he angled gently toward his mic. "Congresswoman," he initiated, "thank you for that. I genuinely, sincerely appreciate you saying exactly what you think of me out loud for the public record. I always prefer it that way. It clears the air and lets us know exactly where we stand." His inflection remained typically mild, unbelievably consistent, and totally empty of spite, wrath, or irony. He sounded strikingly similar to a tolerant, seasoned youth minister peacefully, carefully explaining a convoluted passage of scripture to a highly doubtful, actively defiant adolescent. He politely mentioned that prior to the panel advancing any further with the day's densely packed legislative agenda, he simply wished to pose one solitary, unbelievably basic, foundational query. He swore it was an inquiry completely disconnected from either of their distinct religious beliefs, their individual histories, their ethnicities, or their private convictions. It was, instead, a strictly factual question regarding the tedious technicalities of campaign funding. Extending his hand slowly and systematically underneath the sturdy oak table, he produced a remarkably cheap, slightly scuffed, transparent plastic binder. It was the exact inexpensive, see-through type a fill-in teacher might use to transport evaluated history tests. It was the kind of practical object bought for a solitary, wrinkled dollar at a midnight gas station shop. It appeared completely, almost laughably inappropriate in the majestic, lavish, historically important chamber He set it gently upon the table, laying his palm over it without opening the flap. You believe fundamentally that massive amounts of money corrupts politics. Is that fair to say? Omar reclined heavily into her tall, cushioned leather seat, clearly appearing entirely safe, perfectly comfortable, and completely ready for a lofty, intellectual argument regarding campaign finance adjustments. Absolutely. It is the single greatest existential threat to our modern, fragile democracy. It always has been, and we must fight it with everything we have. Johnson continued, his gentle, southern-tinged vocals never elevating past a casual, almost amiable drone. And you believe deeply, passionately in transparency, total, unvarnished campaign finance transparency? You believe in the American public's absolute, undeniable right to know exactly where every single donated dollar comes from and exactly where every single donated dollar goes? She agreed right away, bobbing her head fiercely, swelling her chest a bit. She proclaimed with pride that this had been her steadfast, unyielding, central political ideology since her initial day holding public office, and it would continue to be her guiding light until her final moment there. And you've publicly stated, and I want to make absolutely 100% sure I get this specific quote exactly right for the official congressional record, we must get dark money out of politics. Transparency is everything. Those are, in fact, your exact chosen words. Omar fired back without a sliver of delay, her tone dripping with justified rebellion. Those are my words, Mr. Speaker, and I proudly, fiercely stand by every single one of them today, right here in this room. Johnson provided a slow, extremely systematic, prolonged nod. It strongly resembled a veteran school teacher confirming a pupil's factually accurate response, while intentionally keeping the ruinous, unanswerable, hidden follow-up inquiry completely obscured from sight. Good. Excellent. I genuinely appreciate that clarity. I just wanted it firmly, permanently established on the congressional record, your exact words, your own voice, your stated conviction before we actually look at what happens to be inside this cheap little plastic folder of mine. I do this specific exercise so that absolutely nobody in the media and nobody in this room can ever say later that you were somehow tricked, ambushed, or forced into a rhetorical position you don't actually hold. You pick this standard. You establish the rules of engagement. You're proud of it. When she gave a brief, slightly irritated nod of confirmation, he politely asked her to grasp that particular concept securely. Gradually, with a nearly agonizing sense of drama, pulling back the transparent cover, he meticulously removed the first ordinary piece of 8x11 paper. He flattened it out on the gleaming mahogany top, intentionally tilting it so the premium broadcast-grade cameras affixed to the south wall could effortlessly record every solitary pixel of the typed text. This document here, he commenced, his tone empty of feeling, is a standard, legally binding Federal Election Commission disbursement summary specifically for your primary campaign committee, Ilhan for Congress. It covers the specific, exact financial reporting period running from July 2019 straight through the election in November 2020. Pushing his wire-rimmed glasses higher up the arch of his nose, he proceeded, reading straight and evenly from the document. During that specific operational period, your political campaign officially made exactly 140 separate, distinct financial payments to a particular private consulting firm called E Street Group, LLC, operating out of Washington, D.C. The total aggregated amount paid out to this single corporate entity was $2.9 million. He stopped completely. He halted his speech. He totally let that massive, astonishing, life-altering monetary number hover heavily uncomfortably and oppressively in the dead, silent, strongly air-conditioned space. Huge, multi-million-dollar figures possess a distinct ability to achieve that effect. They hang suspended in the atmosphere, projecting weight, totally insisting upon being addressed by every person who perceives them. E Street Group is officially co-owned and entirely independently operated by a Mr. Tim Minette. He gradually looked up from the document, his gaze fixing right onto hers without wavering. "Mr. Minette is your husband," he articulated. He declared the personal marital connection simply, brutally, and totally empty of any dramatic tone, self-righteous criticism, or partisan victorious boasting. He allowed the pure, undeniable, profoundly awkward truth of the legal reality to execute absolutely all the difficult labor. He did not require raising his tone or striking his hand upon the table. The catastrophic arithmetic was executing all the yelling for him. Now, ma'am, if we look just a little bit closer at this ledger, your campaign spent roughly $5.2 million in total during that entire grueling election cycle. $2.9 million of that grand total went directly, without passing through any intermediaries, to your husband's private firm. If we break that down into basic elementary school math, that is exactly 56 cents out of every single dollar you raised. Every hardworking public school teacher, every exhausted overnight emergency room nurse, every city bus driver in your home district who deeply, genuinely believed in your progressive message and sacrificed their own comfort to send you $20 from their dwindling checking account. Exactly 56 cents of their hard-earned $20 went directly to a private, for-profit company run exclusively by the man you are currently married to. With his hands peacefully, expertly intertwined atop the exposed, incriminating dossier, staring at her with complete tranquility, he inquired, "I have a few very simple, foundational questions, Congresswoman. Real simple. The exact kind a Sunday school teacher could easily follow without getting confused." Omar's facial tissues clearly, aggressively tightened, her jaw locked into a stiff, rebellious, profoundly furious shape as her brain quickly devised a frantic counteroffensive. "I'm immensely glad you finally acknowledged the role my husband plays, Mr. Speaker." Johnson totally bypassed the defensive thrust, questioning flawlessly, as though asking about the climate, precisely how many full-time W-2 employees E Street Group genuinely retained to warrant such an enormous, historic, multi-million-dollar service charge. She immediately tried to redirect the probe, utilizing common, vague corporate terminology. She ambiguously depicted the business as an extremely vigorous, comprehensive, all-encompassing agency completely populated with incredibly committed industry experts, perfectly managing intensely complicated digital advertisements, nationwide grassroots collection, and huge logistical, physical mail operations. Johnson sliced totally through the dense verbal mist right away, resolutely asking for a precise, provable numerical guess. Trapped by the bluntness of the inquiry, she vaguely, reluctantly proposed that around 20 people were currently participating in diverse, unspecified functional roles. "Can you name 5 of them?" Johnson inquired, gently lifting a solitary, bare hand. "Not all 20, just 5 individuals. Anyone besides your husband." The resulting stillness was total, dense, and tangibly real. It was the sort of oppressive, terrifying quiet that possesses sharp boundaries, angles, and an overwhelming physical mass to it. "Can you name 3? 3 excruciating, profoundly uncomfortable seconds loudly passed on the huge analog clock on the wall. Can you name 1 person, just 1 single verifiable human being who worked at your husband's firm other than the man you share a home with, who actually did the physical day-to-day work that your campaign paid $2.9 million for? Omar shot back, her tone vibrating with barely contained protective fury, asserting angrily that she was not the appointed human resources division for an outside, separate political advisory firm, and that it was a ridiculous benchmark to place upon her. Johnson firmly, cleanly, and decisively corrected her. He mentioned quietly that while she was definitely not the HR division, she was in undeniable legal reality, the only person physically approving and endorsing the huge payments. She had independently funneled nearly $3 million in grassroots, small donation supporter capital to her husband's personal commercial enterprise. Yet she was amazingly, incredibly unable to identify a solitary junior employee who allegedly performed the millions of dollars worth of invoice duties. Johnson smoothly extracted the next immensely destructive document from his inexpensive plastic sleeve. A huge, high-contrast, flawlessly printed capture showing her own 12 strong words demanding the absolute, uncompromising necessity to mercilessly eliminate dark money and adopt complete, steadfast financial openness. He placed this exact printout straight, flawlessly next to the highlighted, yellow-marked FEC monetary record. Next, he performed a remarkably understated, destructive bodily maneuver that every single individual situated in the viewing area, every reporter, and every aide would remember in striking, movie-like clarity much longer than they would recall any yelled dispute, legislative argument, or political posturing from that whole afternoon. Utilizing merely the extreme tips of his fingers, he carefully, cautiously, and gradually squared up the two completely contradictory papers. He matched them edge to flawless edge, corner to flawless corner. He accomplished it exactly the way a fatigued, let-down high school educator arranges two extremely questionable, identically completed exam sheets side by side to conclusively demonstrate obvious, irrefutable copying to a deceptive pupil. Tapping the left document softly with a single forefinger, he pointed out the $2.9 million monetary shift to her husband's personal business, cautioning her that it made up an astonishing 56% of all grassroots supporter donations. Shifting his digit and patting the right document, he gradually, purposely recited her own lofty, widely short visionary, quote, regarding transparency being everything, resting back in his seat, extending his hands far apart with completely exposed palms, appearing authentically, profoundly confused by the total, disastrous breakdown of simple primary school mathematics and logic. He inquired quietly, "So which page is the real one, Congresswoman? Because I have been staring at these two distinct pieces of paper all morning long in my office, and I cannot, for the absolute life of me, figure out how they both possibly belong to the exact same person." Omar sat up rigidly, her spine snapping straight as she aggressively dragged her heavy microphone nearer to her mouth, the metal base scraping harshly against the wood. When the objective, mathematical basis completely fell apart under her feet, she instinctively, frantically leaned on her most dependable, thoroughly utilized, and historically successful strategic maneuver, fiercely, loudly altering the essential character of the dispute itself. "I know exactly what this is," she declared loudly, her pitch swiftly rising in frequency and forceful volume as she effectively accessed a recognized, unbelievably cozy, and politically beneficial reservoir of deep indignation. She expertly, flawlessly tried to shift the whole disastrous, mathematically unfeasible scenario into a focused, malicious, inherently racist interrogation of a marginalized, Black, Muslim refugee woman by a powerful, highly privileged, white male politician. She claimed he had regularly, historically indicated that individuals with her exact background were completely unwanted, unfit, and untrusted in the revered corridors of American power. She attempted a massive, sweeping verbal pivot, urgently trying to force the conversation onto the billions of dollars in completely untraceable, shadowy, corporate dark money presently bankrolling massive conservative political campaigns across the nation. She shouted regarding the nameless, incredibly wealthy corporate benefactors, the fossil fuel sector, and the massive, unaccountable super PAC expenditures that completely, laughably overshadowed her entire lifelong grassroots fundraising history combined. She aggressively, pointedly accused him of purposely, maliciously disregarding all of those massive, systemic, institutional corruptions just to flaunt a flimsy plastic folder for the Fox News cameras and compel a Somali immigrant woman to execute degrading public arithmetic at the front of the congressional room like a trained animal, thrusting her body aggressively forward, aiming a trembling finger directly at him. She loudly, unequivocally categorized the entire series of factual financial inquiries as blatantly focused harassment. She fiercely asserted that every solitary person viewing the live broadcast understood the genuine, profoundly prejudiced, racist, and Islamophobic nature of his questioning. Briefly, for a fleeting, highly electric moment, her heavily rehearsed, fiercely protective evasion actually appeared to work. It was a thoroughly utilized, unbelievably polished, intensely tested counterattack that had effectively neutralized rivals and shut down inquiries in countless past venues. It was propelled by years of deep-seated, highly effective rhetorical muscle memory. An experienced journalist in the second row, sensing the narrative shifting, scribbled rapidly in their notepad. A loyal, youthful aide positioned directly behind Omar provided quick, fiercely affirming nods of support. She momentarily, desperately reclaimed the emotional momentum and the energetic upper hand of the massive room. The deeply familiar, thoroughly trained, highly predictable hesitancy instantly rippled through the audience, the committee members, and the press corps. It was the innate, deeply conditioned, modern American political habit to immediately retreat, apologize, and back down from any severe public accusation of bigotry, racism, or prejudice, rather than bravely, objectively confronting the underlying factual, mathematical, financial dispute that triggered it. This dense, unbelievably uncomfortable, paralyzing tension hung oppressively in the air for approximately 20 excruciating seconds. It might have held longer. She might have successfully escaped the trap. But then, a fellow Democratic congresswoman, seated much further down the sweeping, curved wooden panel, slowly, deliberately, and with immense physical strain, activated her microphone. This particular black female representative was a highly esteemed, deeply experienced veteran who had dedicated 9 grueling, thankless years serving on this exact committee. She had done the hard labor without ever once raising her voice, seeking the glamorous television spotlight, or intentionally attempting to create a viral clickbait moment for social media clout. She had remained completely, stoically, unreadably silent throughout the entire chaotic, shouting morning. But when she finally spoke, her tone was so profoundly exhausted, so incredibly measured, so completely devoid of partisan theater, and so deliberately, painfully chosen that the entire massive chamber instantly quieted down to a dead, breathless hush just to hear her words. "I need to say something," she announced quietly, heavily, promising the silent room she would revert to her quiet observation immediately afterward. Staring blankly, tiredly, straight ahead at the far wall, actively, deliberately refusing to make eye contact with Omar, she stated clearly, "I have defended you, Congresswoman, publicly, on this very committee, on live national television in front of the entire nation. I have taken intense, personal, highly damaging heat for it back home in my district from constituents and community leaders I deeply respect. And I took it willingly, without complaint, because that is what you do for your own team. Taking a long, heavy, emotional beat, she then issued a devastating public and intra-party warning. She told Omar, in absolute, no uncertain terms, not to ever deploy severe, highly damaging allegations of racial or religious prejudice as a cheap, convenient, cynical shield to deflect from a basic, standardized, undeniable campaign finance document. Pointing out with rising frustration that cold, hard FEC financial figures are entirely devoid of religion, race, gender, or political affiliation, she expressed her profound, bone-deep, career-long frustration. She hated watching privileged, powerful politicians cynically use incredibly heavy, historically painful, blood-soaked accusations as highly convenient rhetorical shields against simple, undeniable, objective math. She noted, her voice thick with pure exhaustion and sorrow, that cynically crying wolf over a financial invoice deeply, permanently diminishes the gravity, power, and meaning of those terms for the everyday, marginalized individuals who actually suffer from real, systemic, destructive discrimination on a daily basis in the real world. Pausing even longer this time, letting the oppressive silence completely crush the room, she implored Omar to simply, honestly, and transparently clarify the massive financial transactions. Fill in the blank answer. Just explain the payments to the committee. That is all anyone is actually asking you to do. And if you genuinely, honestly cannot explain them, then just say that out loud right now, and we will deal with the political fallout as a caucus. But do not make the simple question itself into a hate crime. Not for this. Not with those exact, massive, undeniable numbers sitting right there on the table for everyone to see. The ingrained, societal, highly conditioned reflex to instantly back down from Omar's accusations completely vanished like smoke caught in a hurricane. It was instantly, permanently replaced by something far more damaging, terrifying, and lasting for Omar's political career. Explicit, public, bipartisan authorization to relentlessly, aggressively question her integrity without fear of being labeled a bigot. The political tide turned completely, violently, and irreversibly in that exact moment. 3 spots down the dais, a male Democratic colleague who had frequently, reliably allied with Omar on dozens of major progressive bills, leaned heavily, reluctantly, into his microphone, actively, painfully avoiding any eye contact with her, which loudly and clearly signified the immense political and personal difficulty of his unprecedented public admission. He softly, regretfully stated that he had actually formally inquired about the massive E Street corporate expenditures behind closed doors over 2 full years prior. He had acted on behalf of deeply concerned, highly furious local donors and constituents. He confessed, looking down at his hands, that he had been firmly, repeatedly assured by party leadership and Omar's team that the matter was entirely legal, perfectly ethically managed, and that he should simply blindly have faith in the process and stop asking uncomfortable questions. With his hands nervously, tightly folded, he lamented into the hot mic. I trusted the process. I did what I was told. And today I am sitting here looking at 2 pages that clearly, undeniably say the process trusted itself all the way to the tune of $2.9 million. I covered for that. A lot of us in this party covered for that. I will not be covering for it anymore on live national television. A long-time loyal Democratic defender had just publicly confessed to actively brushing off early, massive financial red flags to protect her, and a highly respected black female colleague had explicitly, devastatingly instructed her not to cynically weaponize identity politics to dodge a basic financial invoice. If you have ever been aggressively silenced, shouted down, marginalized, or explicitly told you weren't allowed to ask a highly legitimate, objectively fair question simply because of demographic labels or enforced political correctness, you grasp the absolute, earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting significance of what just happened in that specific room. The narrative had permanently shifted entirely from cash to pure, cold, unforgiving, objective calculations. Johnson allowed the devastating intra-party quiet to linger, smartly letting the Democratic infighting do his exact job for him. He wielded this silence far more effectively, brutally, and ruthlessly than anyone anticipated for a mild-mannered, deeply religious constitutional attorney. He had learned years ago in sweltering, broken-down local courthouses that letting a damning, undeniable, completely objective truth hang suspended in the air is infinitely more potent, destructive, and deeply memorable than any complex, multi-layered legal argument he could possibly construct. I honestly wasn't going to bring this specific, highly sensitive detail up, he finally remarked, breaking the silence, his voice a low, steady rumble, because it is deeply personal, and I do not enjoy dealing in the personal. But you specifically brought up the concept of ultimate fairness, Congresswoman. So let me show you something incredibly interesting about the exact timeline of these disbursements. Tracing the quarterly financial data on the FEC paperwork with a slow, deliberate, highly visible finger, he read aloud, Q4 2018, your political campaign officially paid E Street Group exactly $45,000. That is entirely reasonable. That is a standard, expected, market rate consulting fee for a campaign of your size. Moving his finger slowly, agonizingly down the column, he continued, Q1 2019, $291,000, looking up from the page, piercing her with a highly focused, unblinking look, he noted calmly that this represented a massive, entirely inexplicable 647% financial jump in a single, standard 3-month quarter. Removing his spectacles to slowly, methodically wipe them clean on his silk necktie, a classic, highly effective, incredibly theatrical stalling tactic designed entirely to ensure his devastating, numbers-heavy words sank deeply into the minds of the press corps. He pointed out a catastrophic, highly specific coincidence. He noted, his voice dropping slightly, that Q1 2019 was the exact specific time frame when Mr. Minette's previous legal spouse officially filed highly publicized, extremely damaging court documents. She claimed, under penalty of perjury, that her husband had suddenly, unexpectedly abandoned her, specifically to pursue a romantic relationship with Omar. He quietly, brutally reminded her of her own prolonged, highly aggressive, and vehement public media denials regarding the alleged affair to the national press pool. Putting his glasses back on his face, adjusting them perfectly, he stated cleanly, surgically, and during those exact same months of your intense, aggressive public denial, your campaign's direct, authorized cash payments to Mr. Minette's private firm inexplicably, magically increased by exactly 700%. He rested his wireframes next to the two damning documents. I am absolutely not here to judge anybody's personal private life, Congresswoman. I truly, honestly am not. My personal faith clearly teaches me that such moral judgment is far above my pay grade. But the hardworking American people have a fundamental, undeniable, absolute right to know exactly why a federally funded campaign's payments to a specific single vendor magically went up 700% in the exact same financial quarter that the vendor's legal wife explicitly told a court of law her husband was leaving her for the exact client holding the campaign checkbook. Omar literally gasped her breath catching audibly in the mic. Her mouth dropped open as she desperately attempted to interject. That is disgusting and deeply personal, but her voice horribly, noticeably faltered, cracked, and completely died right on the word personal. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical, made-for-TV break. Rather, it was the genuine, terrifying, visceral hesitation of a highly guarded person who has just had a deeply painful, incredibly exposed, highly guarded nerve struck with a sledgehammer. The subtle yet undeniable vocal fracture was loudly audible to every single person in the room and instantly, permanently captured forever on the high-definition film by the dozens of broadcast cameras. She abruptly panicked, aborted her own sentence. She recognized instantly, with the sharp, deeply ingrained intuition of a seasoned political survivor, that trying to complete her thought or argue the timeline would only dig the hole exponentially deeper and provide Johnson with even more devastating, irrefutable ammunition for his weaponized silence. Johnson then gently, almost politely, pushed both sheets of paper across the polished desk directly toward her, treating them like a highly contagious hazard. I'm going to ask you to do one simple final thing, Congresswoman, and then I will be completely done with my time, and you can go. His volume dropped to a near whisper, a tone so quiet, calm, and compelling that the jaded, cynical journalists in the very back row were physically forced to lean forward, straining their necks to catch every single syllable. I'd like you to hold these 2 pages up right now, one in each hand, and tell the folks watching at home exactly which one is the real Ilhan Omar. The one who proudly, publicly wrote, "Transparency is everything." Or the one who quietly, privately wrote a $2.9 million check to her husband's private company and currently cannot name a single solitary person who actually worked there to earn it. She had absolutely no choice but to physically lift them. Aggressively refusing to do so with the entire nation watching live would serve as a massive, damning, undeniable admission of total guilt in itself. Grasping the dense, spreadsheet-filled financial summary in her left hand and the bold, idealistic printed tweet in her right, she gazed down at both of them. Her visage, a face that had stoically, defiantly endured countless hostile committees, highly aggressive, terrifying death threats, and vicious, screaming crowds, exhibited the exact, devastating micro-expression of total defeat that the 47 high-definition lenses recorded forever. She realized, in real time, under the blinding lights, that there was no possible, conceivable way of bridging the massive, hypocritical, canyon-sized gap between her lofty, progressive public rhetoric and her documented, legally binding financial reality. She slowly, agonizingly lowered both documents synchronously. She placed them flat on the desk with the heavy, exhausted, deeply depressed demeanor of someone finally setting down a crushing burden they are no longer morally fit or physically able to carry a single step further. Johnson calmly, methodically retrieved the papers, neatened the small stack one last time with a sharp, crisp tap on the mahogany desk, and slid them safely back into his cheap $1 plastic folder. "Congresswoman," he offered, his voice completely devoid of any triumphant gloating, "you came to this great country with absolutely nothing, and you built something incredibly real, and I would gladly shake your hand for that incredible, inspiring achievement in any parking lot in America. Nobody in this entire room is questioning the impressive, difficult life you've built against all odds. What is currently on the table is vastly, fundamentally simpler than all of that." Securing his plastic file under his arm, he concluded with a devastating, brutally simple summary. "You looked directly into the cameras and told the American people that transparency is everything, and then you turned right around and spent $2.9 million of their hard-earned money at your husband's firm. And when someone simply asked where it went, you panicked and called the basic mathematical question bigotry. Cradling the flimsy folder with the deep, quiet reverence of a man holding a sacred ancient hymnal, he added, "You didn't fight political corruption, Congresswoman." Setting it down on the desk as softly as a finished, closed novel, he delivered the final, fatal, legendary blow. You just took it home. Before the session even formally adjourned, the devastating video fragment had already been christened online. Someone had precisely, ruthlessly edited a clean 30-second clip. Johnson passing the papers, Omar holding them up, her defeated expression, and the synchronized drop. By mid-afternoon, the footage was inescapable across American social media feeds. They dubbed it the receipt. The most terrifying aspect for Omar's camp was that the public wasn't debating Islamophobia, shadowy political funding, or standard consultancy rates. The argument was simply over. Viewers just watched a politician elevate her own hypocritical quote beside her own staggering financial transfers on an endless, damning loop. Nightly news programs led with the frozen image. One major network broadcast the visual with a lower third graphic displaying solely Johnson's concluding 6 words in stark black and white. It required absolutely no punditry. The text and the visuals spoke entirely, devastatingly for themselves. Over in Minneapolis, 3-year-old Fatima Hassan viewed the viral, inescapable footage on her smartphone while manning the worn register at her Cedar Riverside market. A staunch, dedicated 3-time Omar voter, Fatima still proudly displayed the Congresswoman's faded, curling campaign sign in her shop window. She played the video twice, surrounded by halal goods and international calling cards. She dialed her sister that evening. "Did you see it?" she asked. "I saw it," her sister replied, $2.9 million to her husband's company. Fatima fell completely silent, mentally calculating that massive figure not as an abstract political concept, but through the grueling daily reality of late lease payments, overdue vendor bills, and her meager $347 weekly profit margin. $2.9 million. Do you know how many stores exactly like mine that is? Her sister remained quiet. We sent her to Washington. We knocked on doors for her in the freezing snow. My daughter missed school to hand out flyers. Scanning her cramped aisles, Fatima whispered, and she sent the money to her husband's office in D.C. Disconnecting the call, she secured the shop for the night. As she exited, she paused by the weathered blue placard in her storefront window. She couldn't bring herself to completely trash it, but she untaped it and flipped it backward against the glass. Now, pedestrians on the sidewalk would only perceive a stark, blank, empty white rectangle where a celebrated leader's portrait once beamed. In the murky, heartbreaking territory, bridging steadfast loyalty and utter betrayal lies the quiet realm of profound disappointment. Fatima Hassan had just permanently relocated there.